Welcome to Object Literals. My name is Josh Nell, and I'll be walking us through this. Let's take a look at what an object is. The best way to look is probably MDN. MDN is Mozilla Developer Network. It gives us some great resources on what objects are. Objects is, and basically what they say is an object is a collection of related data and or functionality. One thing I really like to think about when I talk about objects is they're just like a fancy variable. They have a lot more information and they can actually house functions inside of them. It's pretty cool. Let's look at the syntax of an object literal. On line 6 here, you'll see that I have a const with a thing called object name, a thing meaning an identifier. This identifier is then assigned the value of a block of code. These curly braces right here consist of what we would like to call an object literal. It is quite literally an object in its simplest form. Inside of the object, we have a name and a value pairing. These two combined, we can actually access the value on the right by getting the name on the left. Let's take a look at what happens when we console log this out. You can see here I've got a console log. I'm using object name. Notice on the right in my log here, it actually has an object with a capital O. This capital O object shows that it came from a constructor in JavaScript, which we will talk about later. But for now, understand that this is truly an object. And we can see these values. So further down, let's start talking about properties and what they mean inside of an object literal. So inside of here, we have a name value pair. We have a name, age, location, school for a person. Inside of this person object, we are calling these properties. We can access different properties by referencing the object. So notice right here, I've got person. You can see I've got person right here. Everything lines up with what we just talked about, right? Well, let's go further by introducing dot notation. We can access properties within an object by using a thing called dot notation. I'm going to go ahead and uncomment these two lines. And I want you to pay attention before I hit run what happens. I'm using person. And notice what I'm using. I'm using a dot here to traverse this object. Notice it says person, here's person, name, name. Okay, interesting. So before I hit run, what do you think is going to happen? Is Jane going to show up? Or is something else going to happen? Same with age. What do you think is going to happen? Just think about that before I hit run. Okay, here we go. Run. And you can see down here, I've got Jane coming through and an actual number 25. Notice that it kept the types. So Jane is still a string and age is a number. That's pretty cool. We can now start using object literal properties to get a lot more things done. But dot notation is not the only way we can get things done. Let's go check out another thing. This is called bracket notation. I'm going to go ahead and uncomment these two lines. Notice the difference in syntax. Up here with dot notation, I've got a dot and I'm going through. It's actually pretty sensical. And then we introduce some brackets here. We have a brackets, and then inside of these brackets, we've got a string that matches the name. That's pretty interesting. Let's see what happens. I'm going to hit run. And you will notice the location, which is United States, and school, which is Lambda School, both come through as strings. That's pretty awesome. So, which one do we use? Well, it really depends on what kind of data you're receiving. Bracket notation is ideal when the left side is maybe potentially unknown by you or has special characters in it. For example, if we had another property inside of here and we had spaces in front of it, like what if we had last name? Well, that wouldn't work with dot notation. So we'd have to put that inside of a string value. And then we can put in our last name. In this case, we now have our first name, Jane, under name, of course, and last name of Doe here. Probably should be consistent, though, so I'm going to maintain our double quotes. So we've got last name and Doe. Well, if we tried to access last name with our dot notation, it wouldn't work. Let's try it out. Console.log, person.last name. Let's clear this console and run. You can see here nothing's happening because we're actually getting an error. unexpected token. Basically, it doesn't know what to do with this white space and breaks the code. Well, what we can do now is take this and turn it into bracket notation. So open up our brackets, introduce our quotes, and rerun the code. There's dough. So, as you can see, bracket notation is ideal if you have to deal with any kind of special characters or spaces inside of the name side of the name value pairing. Pretty cool. All right, let's keep going down to object methods. Sometimes people get a little confused by the word method because it looks like a function. So let's go study these lines right here. Notice I've created a new object called student. This was person, and this is now student. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and comment out these logs just so we don't get a bunch of logs and we can keep it pretty clean. Run the code here, and there we go. Back to our original object up here. I'll go ahead and console or comment that out as well. All right, so if we come down here, we're now inside of our student object. And notice it's very similar to our person, but this time we've added a method. Interesting. So over here on the left side, we have the same key value pairing going on. I have a key of study. But on the right side, I have a function. And inside of this, I actually have an anonymous function, a function without a name. So I'm passing in a value of a topic, and then inside of here, I'm logging this name. And we're going to be talking about this keyword soon, but I do want to introduce it to you sooner so you can see how it works inside of objects. We must use this dot if we want to access Jane's name. But again, that'll be later in this week. So Jane likes to study a topic, and the topic is whatever we pass in through our argument via the parameter. So let's see how we can actually access this function inside of an object. So by the way, the method is a function inside of an object. So check it out. I'm going to uncomment this. We've got student, so there's student. Study, okay, there's study. And now I'm going to use invoke, which is just our fancy way of saying we're going to call the function. So I'm going to invoke my method, and I'm going to pass in a value of code as my topic of study. Let's see if this all works out. I'm going to hit run. Jane likes to study code. That's pretty cool. So in this case, Jane being the name, which we gained from our this keyword, which we'll talk about later, likes to study, and then we passed in our topic. So that's how we can invoke a method with dot notation with an object literal. But guess what? We can actually use bracket notation as well if we need to, or if that's the code style of the team that you're working on. So in this case, you can see bracket notation just needs that left-hand reference to be in a string, and we just pass in the same invocation with the call. It does the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and clear and hit run, and let's see what happens. Identical. Interesting. My preference is usually dot notation, but bracket notation does have its place when it comes to certain invocations. Okay, let's go down here, and you'll notice I have this thing that says create object methods outside of the object literal. Wow, okay. So I'm going to uncomment this, and we're going to study this code. So what we can do is we can actually add a member to this body here externally. So I'm referencing student. See how it says student and student? But this time I'm saying dot play. So I'm actually calling a method name that doesn't exist inside of here. Interesting. But watch what happens. I use the assignment operator, and I'm assigning an anonymous function and passing in a function with the value of activity. I then console.log this.name. Again, this keyword will come later, but I'm using it to access Jane inside the object. Loves to, and then we pass in the activity. So let's get a proper invocation to see if this works. I'm going to uncomment it down here. So student play method passing in the value of swim. I'm going to clear this and run. Jane loves to swim. That's pretty cool. So what we've done is we've added a method externally. outside of this object's creation. That could be really powerful later on. All right, let's talk about how object literals gain all the methods available to objects in JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out and keep going down here. Now, what I mean by that is let's go look at an object's constructor function inside of Mozilla Developer Network. So the object constructor creates an object wrapper. So when we create an object literal, we actually have access to all of the properties and methods that come with objects. See that O that's capitalized? Does that look familiar? Do you remember when we wrote our first console log up here? Let's go ahead and look at that one more time. Clear, run, and there's that capital O. So we actually have access to all of these methods to do something with our object. Pretty cool. Well, let's check it out and see what we can do. So I'm going to come back to the bottom of this page, and I've got some examples written out for us. So what if I wanted to go through the entries or the name and value pairs of everything inside of my student object? So remember, here's my student. What if I wanted to get all of these inside pieces? Well, I can do that with entries. So I'm using my object, and then I'm using an entries method that's built off of that. Where did I get that from? Well, I went over to my objects constructor. I found these methods, and I went down there and I found, okay, where is entries? It's right there. You go look at how entries works. You grab your object, and then notice that we're using dot notation. This should be familiar to us now because we've learned how to invoke methods on objects. In this case, object dot entries is a method. Isn't that cool? We're using a method that already exists on objects. And we're actually going to pass in the object that we created and see what's going on. Let's try it out. So I'm going to come back here, console.log, objects, entries, student, clear, and run. And notice that I get all of the name value pairs that were inside of that object. That's pretty awesome because now I could start using these in a for loop or in any other way that I want. That's really handy. All right, let's go down here and let's say that maybe I only wanted the keys or only wanted the values. So if I come down here, here's one for just the keys. So notice I can come down here and say objects.keys student. Clear it and run it. All right, there are just the keys that exist in that object. So name, age, location, you get the idea. Now let's get the right side values by getting just the values with the values method. It's pretty straightforward. Let's run it again, and we can see down here that we get the right side or the values side. So Jane, 25, United States, etc. That's pretty cool. So what if we wanted to get a specific value out of these entries? Well, they basically return arrays. So in this case, I can access a certain subset of data by using my array notation, bracket notation. And we're going to go further into arrays shortly. But I can actually access the position of something. So let's go look at this and do a little guesswork. Object.entries, so we learned about the key value pairs being returned on our student object. Let's get the second position in the array because remember arrays start at 0. So what is the second position? What do you think is going to be returned here? Let's find out. Run. And you can see here that the second position inside of this arrays that was returned is indeed age. That's pretty cool. All right. So that is object literals, some of the methods, properties, and how we can actually write your own methods. Pretty powerful for such a simple syntax. Let's move on to the tutorial and try to write something out together. At this point, I would like you to grab this URL and join me in typing. All right, so it says right here, create an object that tells us all about you. This object should include a first name, a last name, an age, a hometown, and a favorite color. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say const me. Go ahead and type this with me. I want to make sure that there are fingers on keyboards at this point. If not, pause the video and catch up. You can do this in any editor you want, but I'm using CodePen here. So I have const, and the reason I want to use const, by the way, is because I don't want to accidentally overwrite all this work I did in an object. So const prevents me from making a human error and overwriting my own code. All right, so let's talk about this. In this case, I need to have a name value pair. And in that name value pair, of course, I want to have first name. So I'm going to say first name. Go ahead and write that out with me. And I'll just do a fictional character right now. You should be doing this about yourself. Actually, first name's going to be Jim. All right, last name. You can put something in, whatever you want. Age. Whatever you want. And notice what I'm doing. Notice I've got these commas in here. These commas separate these values between my object literal properties. Notice I'm not using semicolons. If you tried to use semicolons, it would break it. These commas allow us to add multiple properties. And by the way, on the last item, you actually don't need a comma if you know it's going to be your last item. All right, so we know we've got hometown. And favorite color. Well, make sure you match that case sensitivity. Okay. So hopefully you've written out your object that's all about you. Now that we've got this object, we can test it out by console logging what's inside of it. So I'm going to say console.log. By the way, notice that we're just using a method on the console object. Pretty cool. We're just using the same things we just learned. And we can come in here and say me.firstName. Let's see if it works. I'm going to hit run. And there it is. It did work. Let's try age, since it's a number. Perfect. So in this case, we know our object is working. Let's see what the whole object looks like, just by console.logging me. That's pretty cool. It shows everything inside of our object, all the name value pairs, and it shows us that it is indeed an object. Awesome. All right, once you're done creating your object, do the following. Return a list of the values of your object. Do you remember how we can do that? We can go over to our object entries, and we can figure out, or we can go to our object wrapper here, and we can look at the different methods that are inside of object to accomplish these goals. So, for you, try to write this down before I do. Try to write it down from memory, or go look it up. Pause the video. Challenge yourself a little bit here. Okay, so in this case, if we wanted to return a list of the values of our object, this is talking about the value side or the right side. So if we go back to our object here, we could look for values. There it is at the bottom. So you can see this is how they do it inside of MDN. Let's bring this code into what we're doing, just to show you how you can learn from documentation. So I copied and pasted it in, but notice that object 1 is not what I want. It needs to be the value that I have. In this case, it's me. So console.log, object.values, me. All right, let's clear this out and see if it worked. Jim, Rainer, 35, Marcera, green. Awesome. All those things are indeed the values that I put into my code. Notice something interesting though. Notice that these went alphabetical when we actually had the object, but then when we went through the values, it kept the order in which we wrote it down. Kind of interesting. All right, so if we go down to our next thing with keys, we can probably guess the next one is going to be keys. So we're going to clear it, run it, and you can see that we've got the keys of the front side of our name value pairs. And lastly, it says entries, and that is indeed the keyword as well. Entries returns both the key and value pairs. So let's run this and see if we got all of them. And we did. Pretty cool. So now you have written your own object, you've written your own properties, and you've used object methods to gather those values. Pretty cool. Let's go forward into your object challenge now. So now what I want you to do, by yourself, without my guidance, go through this challenge and try to finish these problems. Once you're done, you can check your work against the solution. Okay, that's it. I hope you enjoyed object literals, and I hope that you have more knowledge going forward with the JavaScript fundamentals.